Hi, I'm Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. This is an episode that I have been excited about basically since I started the show. My guest today is Lorraine Wild, the great designer, writer, and teacher. She runs Green Dragon Office, a Los Angeles design studio that focuses on book design for museums, galleries, and educational institutions. She's been on the faculty of the graphic design program at CalArts since 1985. And served as the director of that program from 85 to 1991. Lorraine's also written some of my very favorite essays on design and design history. She has a deep interest in teaching and thinking about how we talk about design history, and teaches a famous CalArts class on design history that's come up on the show many times. In this wide-ranging conversation, Lorraine and I talk about that intersection of design and writing and teaching in her practice. We talk about her time studying at both Cranbrook and Yale and working for the Vignellis in between those two educational experiences and what that was like. We also talk about design history, how modernism became the dominant aesthetic in the 70s and why we're still rehashing in many ways this modernism postmodern debate. Lorraine holds a unique position in the design field and has seen it from a lot of different angles, and so it was really nice to hear her perspective on all of this. Lorraine obviously was on my list as a dream guest since I started this show, and I have a confession to make. We actually recorded an episode all the way back in March 2018. It was a really great conversation talking about a lot of these things that I'm interested in, and due to technical issues, I lost the recording. In the history of the show, that conversation with Lorraine is the only conversation that I ever lost. And I have been kicking myself over it for years since and wanting to try it again. And so finally it felt like enough time has passed that we could try it again. And I am so glad we did, because I think the conversation that we had now was more thoughtful and interesting and goes in different directions that original conversation I just don't think did. And so this was such a great conversation. I'm so happy with how it turned out. If you like the show, I hope you consider supporting it on Patreon. We offer 3 monthly tiers, $3 for students, $5 for patrons, and $10 for superfans. All of those tiers give you access to all sorts of bonus content like monthly newsletters, early episodes, full transcripts, and exclusive bonus interviews, all while helping to financially support this show. So if you like Scratching the Surface, if you want to see it continue, I hope you consider joining us on Patreon. You can visit patreon.com/surface podcast for all the details and to help support the show. Thank you, as always, for listening. And here is my conversation with Lorraine Wild. I want to begin this conversation in a kind of weird way by actually quoting something that you said in another interview. I was thinking about you and thinking about this conversation, and I reread Louise Sandhaus's interview with you in iMagazine in 2000, so it's like 21 years ago. And her first question was, people know you as an educator, writer, historian, and practitioner, probably in that order. Is that how you see yourself? And you respond, I think of myself as a designer first, and I always have. I'm a designer who teaches and writes. And that really resonated with me for two reasons. One, I've been following your work for years, and for a very long time knew you as a writer and a teacher before I had ever seen any of your design work. And then I feel the same way in my own work, in that in many ways I'm known as a podcaster or a teacher or a writer, but I still identify as a designer first also. And I'm not totally sure why I do that. And I was wondering, A, if you feel the same way 20 years later, if you're still consider yourself a designer who teaches and writes, and why designer still comes first for you.
Well, that's really an interesting question, because one simple and obvious response is to say, because it takes more time. That
Right.
that if I look at how I divide my time up, I feel like the work of being a designer, it really fills it, and the actual work that I do as a book designer is very time consuming. And so there's a kind of, very specific, heavy time commitment to actually making the projects happen along with my colleagues. And so there's just that simple equation. But The other thing is, I'm fully aware of even as a book designer, and I was attracted to book design because it wasn't ephemeral, but there's still an
Mm,
ephemerality to our work as designers. So I'm fully aware that the writing and the teaching, in some ways, is the stuff that builds a legacy. Um,
mm,
I've only met a couple people in my life who've said to me, "Oh, I actually collect books that you design." And actually,
mm.
they've been not other designers; they've been book collector types.
Huh.
Whereas obviously other designers know me from my sporadic and cranky writing or my teaching. So yeah, it's a weird thing. I do, though, all of my, even my writing and teaching has always been oriented towards the idea of this is thought and this is cultural work through the eyes of a maker,
Mm.
and that I've been very focused on that.
Yeah, that it makes a lot of sense, and I want to come back to you saying that your writing is cranky in a bit, but it is. I hadn't thought about it like that. I have read things you've written hundreds of times, like your essay "Castles Made of Sand." I've probably read 50 times at this point. And so there is that certain sort of kind of legacy to the writing and the teaching that maybe the design has less. I mean, the other thing I was thinking about is that you've studied design intensively, perhaps in a way that you haven't with writing and teaching. Not to say that you are not,
Right.
you know you haven't studied them, but your degrees are in design, and you're one of the few people who have a BFA from Cranbrook. And you got that in the mid 70s, right when the McCoys started. And I'm on the record of being a fan of kind of that era of Cranbrook, kind of right before Cranbrook became Cranbrook as we know it. What was that like, being there at that time? What kind of, what did it mean to kind of be a designer at that time at Cranbrook?
You know, the the McCoys, and I jokingly say I went to school with children because I think they were both in their 20s when I was
Yeah.
a student there. Um, the McCoys had um, this very fascinating approach to design where they made both the kind of practice and the culture of it seem utterly intertwined and
Mm,
accessible and open to the students.
mhm,
Like there's this early poster that they did for their program where it's a big collage, and the collage is all things from mid 19th to 20th century design history. And then they list alongside all the topics that they're interested in.
mm,
They were kind of encyclopedic in their interests in design, and but it was not like an extremely, again, it was an art school. It was not. It was a studio based practice, not
mhm,
an academic practice. So they weren't teaching us to be historians. They were teaching us to be informed as makers about history. And again, seeing it as a continuum that you are part of, which is something I really have always maintained in my own
yeah.
design history teaching, that I'm not teaching you the like works of unattainable masters. I'm teaching about a continuum that I'm expecting the students are entering at their
Mm,
own point, and that's something I really brought from them. I was thinking about Andrew Blauvelt organized an exhibition a few years ago at the Walker called Hippie Modernism.
right.
And hippie modernists was a term that I had invented to describe the McCoys.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
Yes, yeah, Andrew acknowledges it in the book. I mean, it came out of us both. I think we were invited to a sort of an event in the honor of the McCoys retiring from Cranbrook, and I think I used it to describe them at that time. And of course, what that was about was they were both, they were basically both trained as an industrial
Hmm.
designers, and they were like fully part of this modernist continuum, except that they were also, people who were adults in the late 60s, or young adults in
Right,
the late
right.
60s. So they had this very utopian, feminist, politically activist, socially critical stance that they brought alongside it. And it really, again, it made design feel like you could use it
Mm,
for something way beyond the simple kind of trade, advertising and publishing, uh, you know, uses that graphic design is generally devoted to. So they really didn't approach it. There was nothing trade about the training um, of
right.
them at the McCoys. And I, being young, I had actually had the advantage of already working as a sort of assistant in a design office in Detroit. That
Mm,
actually was the office where Ed Fellow worked, and
okay.
where Kathy had worked before. And so I knew kind of, I knew how to do it. I didn't need anybody to show me how to make a mechanical. So, what passed for technical training I already had. So I was totally ready for, the ways that the McCoys could open up the subject.
I realize this question, with hindsight might be hard to kind of answer honestly, but were you aware of the unusualness of that and the way that they were interested in design and talked about design? And the reason I ask that is because, this is really before, like I said, Cranbrook kind of became a brand in graphic design. This is before the sort of modernism, postmodernism debates, all of this. Were looking back, can you see the seeds of that, starting at your time there? And were you kind of aware of that at the time?
Well, actually, I would say that I did not fully. I mean, there were things about Cranbrook that I completely appreciated while I was there. However, I would say it wasn't until I got to Yale that I
Okay.
recognized how unusual
Okay.
my education at Cranbrook had been. And I also had, like, fellow students of mine at Cranbrook were really, like, for instance, Meredith Davis was getting her
Right.
MFA while I was there. Patrick Whitney, who went
Mm,
on to go to the Institute of Design at IIT. These were really people whose interests, like, the department could, at that time, um, well, actually, it always could be a home for a very wide variety of opinions and
mhm.
translations of what design practice would be. Again, that's what the McCoys had, this interesting, very unpolemical openness to design culture. Um, so, the thing that Cranbrook became known for later, which was a sort of formal expression
Mhm.
of the ideas coming out of postmodernism and literary theory, that comes a little bit, well, later in the 70s. And definitely I was watching it from afar while I was in graduate school in New Haven. So yeah, that Cranbrook was a bit later. I was at a point where the I mean, I was thinking about projects I did while I was a student there, and one of them was that Kathy had managed to get. In fact, I believe it was Kathy McCoy and Meredith Davis had
Mm.
managed to get a grant from the state of Michigan to both do, I think, a middle school curriculum.
Yes, Meredith told me about this actually.
Yes. So she was working on that. And then another piece of it was a publication, or a series of publications about sort of design in Michigan. Like, it was a
Mm.
real, like, state council
Mhm.
for the arts type project. And I actually took it upon myself to come up with a long essay that looked at, say, a dozen points in Michigan design history that were, worth writing about. And I had this I still remember vividly this crappy Ford Falcon that I had, like driving all over the state to different archives. And the first one that I talked about was the birch bark canoe,
Mm.
and about essentially the indigenous. If Michigan is a place where transportation technologies always flourished, or rather its location, because of being where water and trees was an important nexus, that you had to start with the most efficient way of getting around,
Mm.
in very early times. And so, again, even that didn't seem, you know, uh, I mean, again, I was not an academic historian by any stretch of the imagination. I would even call this maybe more akin to design journalism.
Mm.
But yeah, we produced a publication, and that would just be seen as my work that semester, because there aren't classes at Cranbrook,
Right.
right? So you just
Right.
invented projects for yourself. I was also fascinated by these a weird genre of modern houses that you could find all over Detroit, and
Mm.
we're kind of creating an archive of those. So that, again, my interest in graphic design as a vehicle to create actually archives about history, and write to them, was really established very early by that work at Cranbrook.
This is so interesting to me for many reasons, and I wanted to kind of talk to you about this kind of relationship between sort of the history, the theory, the conversation, design as culture versus design as product artifact, in kind of where that came from for you. And it sounds like it was there right from the beginning. Is that something? Did you have an interest in that before Cranbrook, or is that something that really developed during your time there?
I was a kid in high school who, although I was known as, one of the art kids, it was never divorced from writing.
Mm.
I, for instance, started a school poetry magazine where I went to all my friends and collected their writings and then designed it, or I worked on the
Wow.
school paper, but I also laid it out. So I never,
Right.
I was fully aware that I had this absolutely split personality, in terms of my interest in the visual world. And I happened to have really good writing teachers in my high school who,
Mm.
very even as early as 10th grade, were teaching us to read criticism of literature.
Wow.
Like a classic thing would be, reading Huckleberry Finn and then reading the critiques of that, or Leslie Fielder's
Right.
writing on American mythology. So that issue of, oh, okay, creative work goes out in the world and then it keeps having a life, is something that I understood really early. And that's, I think, what I carried, what I already had when I got to Cranbrook, undoubtedly.
Mhm.
And also, I a friend. This is like you meet a drug dealer or something. A friend of mine who was like a year older and who went to school on the East Coast, who I'd known from high school, called me up and said, "Have you ever read this book by Rainer Banna? I think you'd like it." And it was Theory and Design in the First Machine Age. And I
Yes.
still remember sitting in my parents' backyard at age 19 reading that, and it freaking blew my mind. And I realize now that was like my, road to Damascus. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, and what was it? So it wasn't only this history of architecture, but it was his connecting it to art practice, like
Right.
futurism and Dada, and bringing that in, and then again the time and the distance. And then when I recognized that he wrote all the time about contemporary design, then it all made sense to me. That of course, I didn't. I don't know. Maybe I thought he was also a designer. I didn't realize he was just a writer.
Right.
Just a writer. But
I mean, it's interesting that you say that though, because as you were telling this story, I was wondering if you were seeing, this writing, the criticism, even, kind of thinking about, your high school poetry magazine. Was were the projects that you were doing at Cranbrook, was the writing, the history, the being in archives, did you see that as a supplement to the design work? Was that changing how you were thinking about being a designer, or did that feel like a separate thing?
Actually, no, it felt one and the same to me. But I also wasn't clear myself.
Mm,
Actually, when I left Cranbrook, I remember thinking about like what was I going to do next? Well, my plan all along had been to go to New York. Like that was
okay.
the plan. And so, you know, I get to New York, long story, end up working for Vignelli, Massimo
Mhm,
Vignelli, and um, a question that had started kind of bugging me at Cranbrook was literally amplified when I got to New York in the kind of straight on modernist environment
mhm,
that I was functioning in, which was how did this get here? Now, to explain what I couldn't figure out, the question that bugged me at Cranbrook was how, and the mid the mid 70s was kind of this interesting period where suddenly a lot of new writing about the Russian constructivists
mm,
was being translated. So there was like a book by a guy named Simon Boyko, I think, about like new graphic design in revolutionary Russia.
mhm,
There,
yeah,
there was actually a publisher in Ann Arbor connected to the university that dealt in Russian literature, but would also reproduce pages out of, constructivist poetry
mm,
magazines. So there was all this interest. And then of course, if you looked at the classic like Herbert Spencer or even Joseph Mueller Brockman's, history of
mhm,
graphic design, you saw this trajectory of like, okay, there's the avant-garde 20s, or at least a kind of very loose understanding of it at that point. And then, the Bauhaus, and then you have Swiss design.
mhm, mhm.
And I remember going to Kathy McCoy and saying to her, "Well, what happened here? Like, what happens in the middle?" And her
Right, right.
and her response was only tacky stuff. We've laughed about
I
this.
love that.
And so I started getting interested in like, okay, well, what was that tacky stuff? Like I didn't get how the DNA of American contemporary graphic design was deemed to be a European lineage.
Mhm,
And so I just wanted to understand how things got there. And when I got to the Vignelli office, I didn't have many conversations with Massimo about design history, but one of them I remember asking him, "Well, like, who do you like?" And he said, "Oh, well, I like, Paul Rand and Lester Beale." And
Right.
so then I thought, because honestly, like neither Paul Rand nor Lester Beale were even looked at Cranbrook. And so I thought, well, okay, who are they? And so I started this thing while I was working at Massimo's office where on Saturdays I would go to the New York Public Library and I would just start digging around.
Mm,
And I'd go in the reading room and the card catalog and say, well, can you give me 10 years of Gebrauchsgrafik from Berlin, which of course they had, and then you'd wait an hour and then somebody would come with this giant cart. And I would just look through these things looking for any trace of where the European stuff was being reproduced in things that Americans saw,
hmm,
or, I was just trying to find it because, again, this is pre megs, this is pre
right.
all of that. And actually, because I worked for Vignelli, I was doing all this work for the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, and particularly working on a tabloid paper called Skyline.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
and the two editors of it were the late great Craig Owens, an
Mm-hmm.
incredible writer and art critic, and another guy named Andrew McNair. And I remember kind of like the kid in the office telling them what I was doing, this little project on the side, and they said, you could get a master's degree for that kind of work. And then I thought, well, okay, well, where do I do that? And I couldn't. As a Detroit working class kid, I knew I could go to Great Britain maybe and get a design history degree, but I couldn't imagine how I could do it. Like there was just no,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I had no basis to imagine studying
Right.
abroad.
Right. No, I get that. I totally
Yeah.
get that.
And so then when it finally dawned on me that all the people I was interested in their work from like late 30s and 40s were actually still teaching at Yale. So I thought, well,
Yeah.
I'll just go there.
Okay. Okay. But okay, I have a couple questions. I have a couple questions about this. Because I want to talk to you about Yale for a second, but I do want to talk about Vignelli just for a second. Because I think it's interesting that you were sort of questioning a lot of this and really kind of digging into this history. And I know you said you didn't talk to him about history too much, but I'm wondering what that was like to work in that office that now is seen as a very kind of strict Swiss modernist philosophy, true believer. um did you get into that? I mean, it sounds like you were always kind of skeptical. Can you just talk a little bit about you know any, like, not personal tensions, but kind of work tension of kind of working in this mode in this office that is known for this, but kind of questioning it on the side and spending your Saturdays kind of digging in the archives to figure it out? What was that like?
Um, yeah. I could write a book about it.
I think you should.
I, the okay, first of all, when I worked for Massimo and Layla, and this was 77 and 78. Um, the office was quite small. It was before they became the kind of juggernaut that they became later in the
Mm,
like the 90s and the uh, it was really just uh, Massimo and Layla, uh, an office manager, and I think there were three of us
mm,
in the office, and one of my colleagues, of the three young designers, one was an Italian guy who actually was an accomplished designer, but the Vignellis were helping him get his bearings in the United States, and the other was a guy who'd gone to University of the Arts in Philadelphia,
mm,
who had been totally inculcated into the Swiss style. So,
mm-hmm.
like,
Yeah.
he had no problems, whereas I was sitting there wriggling and cringing and going crazy because there were so many things that seemed not quite right to me, because I already had this feeling that graphic design should be responsive to content, situations, et cetera, et cetera. And of all the designers functioning in New York at that time, Massimo had the strongest signature
Right.
in his work, stronger than anybody. And actually, one of the kind of humorous uh, aspects of working in that office, at least as I observed it, was that pretty much everyone who walked in the door as clients already knew they wanted it, like,
Right.
obviously. So there
Yeah.
was no, like, what people think of as research and process didn't exist. Like,
Right.
we would, because it was already there, like the
Right.
solution was somewhere in the flat files. And and my job as a young designer would be to take the situation at hand and essentially find the right template
Right. Yeah.
for the thing that we were doing. And understand the kind of precision with which it had to be implemented. But it wasn't, I didn't, I certainly, that was where I suddenly started. I never questioned my training at Cranbrook, but I did see it as like something else, you know, that,
Yeah.
that this was. And I also understood that other young designers I knew at other offices where they didn't have quite that um, rigid of a formal approach did in fact there was a bit more of
Hmm.
that kind of research melded with the work. But no, I was thinking about when I went to show Massimo my portfolio, and I know that he was interested in me because I'd gone to Cranbrook, and I thought he thought that I would be like an Eames type design.
Oh,
Which, and
right.
you know,
That makes sense.
yeah, and actually, I think he could. I mean, to be honest, I think Massimo understood whatever vestiges of intelligence there was in my work at that time. But I also remember him stopping, and I had done a restaurant menu that was all in Corinna, and that was when I got the speech. He says, Lorraine, we would only use, and at that time
Right.
it was like Helvetica times Garrett Mon and Bedoni. It's like, okay, fine. And so, I essentially had signed on. And in fact, the first project I had to do with in the office was working on a courthouse signage for an architect named Harry Wolf. And the
Mm.
courthouse signage was in avant-garde, and I felt really mad. I remember thinking, "Wait a minute,
Yeah.
you didn't say avant-garde."
Right.
And
So, I mean, so I guess like the question that I'm interested in that, and that's kind of what I was expecting you to say about that actually, but I'm thinking about you then doing this research, on Saturdays, and then deciding to go to Yale. I, I'm still curious about sort of your intentions, I guess, or
Mhm.
or if there was an ambition there. Did you think you were becoming a historian? Was this like I guess the question I'm asking is like, why was this so interesting to you? Did you feel like there was like something more to this work that you were doing? What was kind of driving you at this time?
Pure curiosity. I
Mm,
really don't like, you know, I thought, okay, first of all, I did. I knew when I went to Yale what I wanted to do. And now that I work with grad students, the idea of a grad student walking in with a preordained project is kind of scary.
yeah.
And I realize now that I really annoyed the faculty
Yeah.
at Yale. I mean, really annoyed them. And by the way, just to clarify, we're talking about pre Sheila de Brett-Phil. We're talking about
Right.
the old history of Alvin Eisenman, Paul Rand, Bradbury Thompson, Herbert Matter,
Right.
Chris Pullman. And so, no, I knew when I walked in that I had every intention of doing this. I knew that I wanted to take Vincent Scully's architectural history
Mm-hmm.
classes. I didn't know what else there was, but I felt, and this is, my only, well, my critique of my own education was that I had talked my way into Cranbrook at age 19, and I knew that I was missing some stuff. And so I
Mm.
thought, well, okay, I'll go to Yale and I'll take, I'll audit classes till I'm blue in the face, and I'll do that silly design work. Like I already knew that I was not, well, okay, I shouldn't even say this. I should say that at that young age, I was extremely egotistical, and I thought I knew everything about typography and graphic design that I needed to know. And I really didn't think I was
Mhm.
going to, I didn't, think I wanted to go to Yale to write. And and yet I knew I didn't think I would ever get accepted to an art history program, and there really wasn't one. I realized later that I maybe could have been an American Studies major and done the same thing. Because in fact, one of the best classes I took was in the American Studies department. It was a class by a woman named Margaretta Lovell in material culture, and kind of taught all the different ways of looking at, a man-made object and how to read things,
Mm-hmm.
outside of the point of view of the maker, which for me
Mm-hmm.
was kind of important at that time to understand. I remember my first crit at Yale having, I think Bradbury Thompson saying, "I think you're taking too many classes outside." Um, when somebody
Wow.
asked me what I was doing.
Yeah.
And so, but at the same time, I mean, I shouldn't, believe me, I'm fully aware of all my own foibles, but, and how I presented at the time as a student. But at the same time, what I was naive about, was how much resistance I got from people like Paul Rand or Bradbury Thompson when I went to go write about them.
Mm-hmm.
And I really do feel that I approached it with a very open heart. Like, I wasn't there to write
Mm-hmm.
about their past and excoriate them. I just wanted to
Mm-hmm.
understand what they were looking at, how they thought about their work, and all that. And I felt that that would help essentially crack the code of this kind of modernist juggernaut of the
Mm-hmm.
late 70s. You know, modernist graphic design in the late 70s is pretty bad, or at least in my mind, kind of dead,
Yeah.
and run by, as I put it in the essay that you mentioned, Castles Made of Sand, full of inexplicable conventions and rules that you couldn't make sense of. And so I was trying to get at the bottom of that. I guess I felt I was doing a public service to graphic design. I just needed to try to understand it.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to the comment that you said earlier about, your writing being cranky, because I don't see your writing as cranky at
Oh,
all. And I think there's actually like a lot of writing, a lot of design writing from the 80s and 90s that is very cranky, and I don't think yours is that. And I think, what you just said about approaching it with an open heart, kind of really like
mhm.
open-hearted kind of critique, to me has always come through in your writing, and it's what I've always admired and liked about your writing, is that you can be a very sharp critic, but but it does not feel uh cranky or angry or mean in any way. And I think, your writing is very personal. You tell stories, you bring yourself into the writing, and colleagues and like people that it's like it's written in this very I've always thought of it as friendly in a weird way, and I'm wondering kind of how you developed that voice or that approach or that tone in your writing, of kind of being okay bringing yourself into it, approaching it very essayistically and letting it kind of go different places. How did that come about?
Um, well, okay, first of all, I have to say that almost every piece I've ever written has been motivated by annoyance. And so that's why I say cranky.
I
So,
get that.
so
Yeah.
I'm negatively inspired. And I would say as a designer as well, like I think my instincts as a maker are like, let's fix this thing.
Hmm.
It's not about, oh, I have a vision and I'm going to make the world beautiful. It's more a repair job. And so,
I get that. I totally get
um,
that.
and so that's often the thing that's behind it. But if I had to say, okay, my models for, uh, so I'm one of those people who had to run to the newsstand to get either Cream magazine or
Mm,
the Village Voice to read Lester
mm,
Bangs. Like, Lester
yeah.
Bangs was one of my earliest idols in terms of the way that he wrote and his implication of himself in his writing, like his examination of his own tastes, his own point of view. Another writer whose work I adored, who in the journalism well, actually all along, it was Michael Sorkin. Who,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Michael Sorkin, it's true. He was kind of, the bad boy of New York architecture critics. He would say things that nobody else would say, but he said them with such humor and such
Yeah.
charm. And, I just felt that to write, I mean, I have to admit, I read a lot of academic things, and I'm not a fan of heavily academicized writing. I still think the issue of voice, if you want anybody else to read you besides another academic, is utterly critical. So the other person who's it was really important to me when I was doing my research for my thesis at Yale was to finally kind of encounter Alvin Lustig's writings,
Mm.
which there had been one compilation that was out of print. I have this like worn out Xerox of a book that was done. And Alvin Lustig's writing blew my mind because I felt like, okay, like if you want to compare two sort of mid century writers, designers, like Paul Rand, I feel like he must have done 12 drafts for everything he wrote, because it's like pronouncements from on high,
Right. Right.
and whereas Lustig felt like he was sitting down and telling you how he was experiencing his own thinking processes and his own ideas about
That's
design.
right.
And there was essentially more of a quality of less pronouncement and more witnessing. And
Mm.
when after I got out of graduate school, I ended up at University of Houston,
Mm-hmm.
and my intention had been, I had kind of thought I would keep doing my historical research, but then I couldn't because the archives that I needed
Mm.
to access were back in New York, and I just couldn't. I lost the narrative when I got to Texas, and but at the same time, I thought, well, wait a minute. There's this other model, and it's to write about the now, and
Mm.
that I had seen that, in the writing of Lustig, that had really inspired me.
I think that's really well said. I think that's a perfect analogy also, because that's exactly how I read your writing, is that you are taking us on, not, I don't mean for the, I'm not just saying this to you because because we're talking, but what I always like about your writing is we are kind of going through your own thought process, the things you see. It isn't those, those kind of pronouncements from on high. I'm curious how doing that writing changed how you approach design. Do you think, this kind of deep history research, do you think looking around and thinking about it and writing about it, did that change your own approach to the design projects that you were doing and are still doing?
Yeah, I would say to this day, one of the reasons, for instance, as a book designer, I don't have a specific style.
Mm. Hmm.
For instance, I love, love, love the work of Irma Bohm, but you know an Irma Bohm book when you see it, whereas you
Yeah.
don't know one of my books when you see
Right.
it. You don't
Right.
know till you hit the call font. And that has to do very much with my idea about graphic design essentially inflecting toward the content, reflecting the time that it's made.
Mhm.
I my interest in design history made me incredibly critical of many books that are about that use historical styles, but in a kind of cartoonish or caricature way.
Mhm.
Like again, I wanted to design in the present, but acknowledge history. And
Mhm.
so, a lot of I do well now. I work on a lot of museum exhibition catalogs, and I often, along with my Green Dragon office colleagues, we bring research to the work. We try to understand it
Mm.
in a historical model. And sometimes that's appreciated and sometimes it isn't, but we do it anyway, because to me, it's what gives the work uh, a kind of life, again, beyond simply the job at hand.
I'm curious kind of your thoughts on how both the design discourse and even design education and how we teach design has changed over your career. And we've spent a lot of this conversation, kind of talking around modernism, postmodernism. And I think in many ways we're still living in that shadow, even though we've also moved past it. But there's still this sense of there's like design work and then there's experimental work that I still see that sort of paradox. And I'm wondering how you think that has evolved and kind of where we are now in how we talk about graphic design.
If I think about what happened, um, well, let's just say from the late 80s and the early 90s, you know, to me the big marker is macro media director. Like
Mm.
that's the big divider,
Okay. Okay.
which I think is 1994, when suddenly, motion turns into a thing you can do with ease
Hmm.
at a computer. That starts really, really changing the way that people had to respond to teaching design. But up to that point, I think the thing that's so interesting now, looking more and more essentially historical about that sort of decade, like mid '80s to mid '90s, is is the kind of focus on design as a language.
Hmm.
And, to me, the best of it is kind of breaking up that formalistic, the kind of obsession with form as there being essentially a correct form, right?
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and that instead you have a diversification of the idea of different languages, different audiences. It's funny. I think a lot of that work has been buried.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the critiques now of graphic design education, especially around a kind of, the languages around even decolonizing, or moving away from capitalism, or all that.
Hmm.
It's like, if you look back, that stuff was all, I'm not saying it was effectively settled in the 90s, I'm saying it was raised.
Right.
um,
Exactly.
that it's all there, and then it got basically, I would say, plowed under by the technology juggernaut. The fact that starts the phase when everybody has to learn how to design differently.
That's interesting.
And,
Yeah.
and so it kind of got run over. And, I think I don't know. I mean, I think there's a really somebody's PhD on graphic design in the 90s would be quite interesting, because, I remember going to, well, I was going to Holland and to London in the mid 90s a lot, because I had this kind of part time teaching gig at the Jan van
Oh
Eyck.
yeah. Yeah.
And, that was when I started seeing, the revival of Helvetica and the revival of
Hmm.
modernism. And I remember thinking, oh, damn it. Like, what's,
Yeah.
what's this?
Yeah.
And of
Yeah.
course, then the onslaught, the critique that everything about postmodernism was too personal, too blah, blah, blah. But that was running over the kind of critique that postmodernism had brought, where there was an attempt to break up the kind of monolith
Yeah.
of modernism. And so, I don't even have this worked out in my own head, but I know that the 90s are when it got all messed up. And so you see, like, for me, me as an old person, to hear the critiques now of graphic design teaching, I'm like, Yeah, what did happen? Like, where did it all backslide? I think there's a lot more terrible graphic design teaching out there than even I know, or there must be.
Yeah, I mean,
Places where
yeah,
learning the Adobe Creative Suite is deemed an education. I guess. I don't know.
right. I mean, no, that's exactly right. And that's kind of what I was saying, where I felt like we're still living in the shadow, and that, like, we're not calling it modernism versus postmodernism, but it feels like the same thing. And I think you're exactly right that a lot of these questions around, sort of decolonizing, around kind of plurality, identity, all the things that we're talking about today, using different language, we
Yeah.
can question its effectiveness, but those were kind of the same conversations. I think that's actually really well said, and really articulated.
Just one more thing. I think one of the interesting aspects of that was perhaps distracting was the translation into form. And then also, I would say that kind of another part of the like imaginary PhD paper on the 90s is all those arguments around voice and the
Right.
designer's voice and authorship and all that. And so that kind of got into it also. And so now you've got this much more upfront social critique again. And I think the interesting thing is going to be, does it get a form? Does it stay more effective by not being granted
Mm.
a form? Like if there's no style, like what, like maybe it's better that it doesn't have a style. Maybe that's what keeps it alive. I don't know.
That's really interesting. Let me ask you this question sort of on the inverse. When I had your colleague, Mr. Keaty, on the show,
Hmm.
he made a remark that I think about all the time, where he says that graphic design, and I'm kind of summarizing his quote to me, so don't hold this against him, or give him all the credit. Um, that graphic design is a 20th century thing that does not really exist anymore, and that, what we call graphic design is actually probably better understood as something else. And then I also interviewed Michael Rock for something else I was working on, and he said something similar, and he said he thinks graphic design sort of kind of ended in 2008 with the launch of the iPhone, where suddenly sort of the tools of design were in everybody's pocket, and that, now, an Instagram story is also a type of graphic design, and that there's some sort of new thing. And I think I am buying into this argument. I think there is truth to this, and I don't think, design education has fully kind of reconciled this idea that that everybody has access to these tools, and that, that opens up a whole other set of questions. Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, looking at the mismatched lowercase a's on the Meta logo this morning, um, I was wondering about whether graphic design was still alive myself. No, I actually do think that, I mean, this is where uh, my sense of history is I'm actually in agreement with those guys. I do think that graphic design as we know it is not really, or as
Mhm,
we knew it, excuse me,
mhm,
is kind of gone. And there are so many indicators of that that you've already heard.
mhm.
Um, I do think it's some other communicative, visual
Right.
communication that is still operative. However, it is so um, uh, there are so many kind of different levels. Like you're right, anybody can make an Instagram story. Um, on the other hand, I just watched the Velvet Underground documentary by Todd
Oh,
Haynes.
yeah, me too.
Oh my
I just
God.
watched it too.
Well, didn't you think that the essentially visual storytelling
Oh,
in
yeah.
that documentary is incredible? Where's
It was so good.
where's the continuum? Like, that's graphic design.
Yeah.
in motion, and so is
Yeah.
Instagram stories. So where do you go in there?
Yeah.
I think, and who are the who are the leaders? I mean, I feel like I'm the only thing. I guess the only thing that makes me sad about the death of graphic design is that I feel that it kind of has collapsed before
Mm.
a really full understanding of what it was reached. And again, there are all these, there seems to be a pretty intense interest in the history of graphic design now and in the teaching of design history and all that. And yet I think the real issue is what parts of its history are relevant to this wholly different practice. um,
Mm-hmm.
when I go to, when we design a book at Green Dragon Office, other than the fact that all the files are digital, we're still bringing a kind of literary, we're
Right.
bringing beyond the 20th century. You're still dealing with conventions, set up in the 16th century, on how books work, right? So, so you're dealing with a legacy there. But if you're a motion designer, isn't your
Mm-hmm.
real legacy in the history of film?
Mm.
What do you got to learn from Paul Rand about that? Who
Mm-hmm.
cares? So it's just, and again, that the ubiquitousness of the tools, uh,
Yeah.
creates all sorts of, the sort of diversity of language is now, it doesn't need to be enabled by anybody's theory. It's enabled by the tool itself.
Right. Right. And that in some ways the role of the designer, as we know it historically, is the person designing those tools now.
Right.
The,
Yeah.
the interfaces and the software and the the experience there. And so, it's moved from designing the artifact to designing the tools for other people to make also, which then is a whole other history.
Right, right. And again, there were always hints of it, and
Hmm. Hmm.
but that's why in the end, okay, to go back to design history, to me, the interesting stuff about it is largely still missing. Like, for instance, it's the social and cultural and political history of design, not the litany of who did what
Yes.
when. And
Yes.
even clients, it's like, come on, where are the clients? you know
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
um it's not enough to just say, oh, here's a designer you've never heard of and she designed this. It's like, yeah, but that's cool, that's great. And again, we're fleshing out the idea that all kinds of people made design, but I'm also interested in how the design functioned and who paid for it, and what was it
Hmm.
doing.
Hmm.
What were people doing with it? And that's the, where I do see the usefulness of history.
Yeah.
It's just that
Yeah.
there's a lot of bad history.
Yeah. 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 Uh, Lorraine, I could talk about this with you all day long, which I will not do. So I will ask you my last
And I'm
question, which is the
carefully not
question.
naming names.
Yeah,
That's for off.
yeah, we can do that after we hit
Yeah,
record. We
right,
can
right.
we can do the unedited version. My last question is the question I used to end all of these. I'm curious what you're reading right now.
I knew you were going to ask me this, and I was thinking of my, like, obviously during the pandemic, I had a lot of time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And back to this issue of the context for design, because my whole interest, not that I've actually written about the mid-century at all for ages now, but my continuing interest in trying to understand, actually, the American context for modernism, kind of his, and also actually, um, working with, on the hippie modernism
Hmm.
project with Andrew Blauvelt, and I've got this interest in the mid-century. So like that Louis Manon book that he recently published called The Free World.
Yeah.
That's kind of a history of War culture. I found that really fascinating. And then there's another book I read recently was Pamela Lee's book called Think Tank Aesthetics.
Oh yeah, I haven't read that yet, but I have that book on my shelf.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. As is she's at Yale now, but her colleague from Stanford, a guy named Fred Turner, wrote a really
Mm-hmm.
interesting book called The Democratic Surround
Mm-hmm.
that is
Yeah, that's a
about
great book.
multimedia. Anyway, so that whole like Cold War zone is something I'm super interested in. And then Glenn Adamson's book, I know you've interviewed him,
Yep.
that book on an American history of craft and
Yeah.
American history. I thought that was amazing because even though it's, because of his redefinition of craft as work, I found that there was a lot to think about as a designer and
Mm-hmm.
as a maker, quote unquote.
Mm-hmm.
To read his kind of take, which I think moves the understanding of craft into a much more open-ended practice that obviously affects both design and art making.
Yeah, I agree. And Glenn mentioned the Manon Cultural Cold War book when I had him on the show too,
Oh, interesting.
as
Yeah.
being very influential in his thinking. So that makes a lot of sense. This was so interesting, Lorraine. I'm so glad we get to do this finally. Like I said, I could talk to you all day. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this.
This episode was recorded on October 29th, 2021. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can support the show on Patreon and find previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.